All right, guys, welcome back to the PAWCast. Today I have Dr. Katie in the studio. We're going to be talking a little bit the balance of mentorship. So here we go. All right. New intro and everything. That's really new to you.
Yeah.
I like surprising people with it. We had Caroline in here last Thursday or whatever it was. And she was just like, all like staring at the screen. I'm like, Caroline, take it easy. She's like, I love it. Thanks for joining me, Katie. First time in the new space, weirdly enough.
Ish.
I think so.
I feel like there was
a leadership meeting in here in August. I think that was the last time that you and I sat in this room together.
That's probably a true story.
We decided just to kind of warm the day up with some stuff talking about mentorship because we have a talk with MSU here later this afternoon. But one thing that you had brought up kind of in discussion with that was a article that I'll have linked in the description here to a mentoring guidelines from the American Animal Hospital Association. It's a little bit old, yes. But when we heard originally talking about that, it was really just about setting kind of the standards on both sides, right, of what a mentor-mentee relationship is and kind of our own opinions on how it's gotten skewed. And then we kind of paused the conversation to pick it up here. So I'll let you kind of kick off what brought it up for you.
Well, and a big part we talk about at PAW and in the profession is fulfillment. Mm-hmm. And, one of the issues in veterinary medicine that we've identified is lack of fulfillment. Mm-hmm. And one of the repeating themes I see on different veterinary boards, when I see people leaving, jobs, wanting to change jobs, it's a lack of mentorship.
Okay.
And I think one of the underlying issues with this lack of mentorship is that the relationship isn't defined. Mm-hmm. I was promised mentorship. What did that actually mean? Because I have a feeling it meant two very different things to the people in that relationship, and it wasn't successful because I am over here with my definition of what mentoring is, and you are over here with your definition of what being a mentee is, and it's a divergent pathway, which...
Yeah, it's not sustainable.
Right.
And that was kind of, it colors a little bit about what we're going to do a little bit later today. But in looking through this article, that's really what they detail out is just, it's not necessarily the best way or the worst ways or tips and tricks and that sort of stuff of setting, what you're supposed to do in a mentor-mentee relationship, but it's more about just setting that standard. What are you expecting out of me? What am I expecting out of you? And making sure that you're not at least going to diverge too far away from each other. To expect perfection is probably not a fair standard to set. And
I think it's a great opportunity in that relationship to practice conflict.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
When something doesn't go right, whether it is communication with the client, whether it is a surgical procedure, and the mentor needs to provide some sort of constructive feedback about that, and to say, can it be done in a positive way? Yes, but are you going to accept that feedback positively also? Yeah. And so, like I said, it sets the stage for, being able to work through conflict. And if you have the conversation about, okay, how are we going to handle this when it arises, because it will, ahead of time, you have already, again, kind of setting the stage for success instead of failure.
And that actually goes back a little bit to what Carlo and I had talked about like the difference between a star mentor and a star leader is having kind of the self-awareness to know which way you align, because although you and I are very different people, I think one of the things that we share is that we lend ourselves more towards being leaders or just pace setters,
Sure.
not necessarily people that lead from behind and kind of push everybody forward. And there's, again, like as we talked about in the previous podcast, there's nothing wrong with having that one way or the other, but you have to know who you are, as well as if you're a mentee, what are you looking for? Are you looking for somebody that you're trying to chase after and like that that will propel you forward, or do you need somebody to come behind you and kind of help you pick up when you feel like you're slowing down? So having that perspective is pretty crucial at the onset of that type of relationship. Basically wanted to kind of flip through this thing too.
Sure.
And just touch on some of the highlights that I found. Because I actually found it to be very interesting. I've watched TED Talks and different stuff, and mentoring is something that is almost to the point, and I think the thing that is pushing it in the way that we're going to talk about is it's getting cliche.
Well, it's become one of those words that everybody uses, and nobody really defines.
Right. It's similar to the way that I see our culture use the word accountability. It's like we all want it, but no one knows what it actually means. So yeah, definitely mentorship is one of those things. And let's see here. I'm
interested to, like, for you to bring up a couple of the points, just because you are started out as an outsider to veterinary medicine, but you've seen the different stages of our mentorship at PAW, and I mean, sometimes those end up more successful than others. It's just the way life works. And so again, I'm interested to kind of find out what caught your eye.
Yeah. And it's my background. Like, I've actually been pretty blessed that I've had a few mentors already in my life that have, it's been in different circles and that sort of stuff, but I tend to create few but deep relationships. So it does lend me a little bit more into that role. But one of the things that kind of caught my eye is really just like, what is a mentor expected to provide in a general sense? It's the mentor provides valuable knowledge, expertise, and support, while the mentee provides enthusiasm and an open mind. That is probably the thing that I guess, like, for me, I probably creates that relationship a little easier. I love being enthusiastic. I love thinking about things in different ways. When I was over at Catch-All, one of the indicators on the Advanced Insights is coachability. And every time I would see that, I would be like, that's what you have to maximize on. Right. Because when you're trying to create these relationships with people that have more wisdom, more intelligence than you, that's what they're going to look for. They're not going to want to have what they say fall on deaf ears. So the more that you can engage with it in a way that's effective for the both of you, and you can challenge it really in practice, but also just in kind of the abstract, the better you both get. Because if I have an idea and I share it with you, and you say, well, what if we do it this way? And we just engage. Now we're just both improving. I think that's the thing that's missing, and what you kind of wanted to hit on. It's like, mentorship isn't just a one-way street. Right. It's not the mentor just feeding down. That's a lecture. And there's a place for that, but it's school. And I think that's kind of the shift that we're really looking for once these students come from school and they step foot into the clinic. It's like, no, this is back and forth here. So kind of what are your thoughts there on kind of the back and forth?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll bring up the last extern. I really enjoyed our last student extern because it was certainly more of a conversation between, well, this is, what I've done in school. And she had some before vet school experiences that were very unique. And so that, like I said, I certainly feel like she learned from myself and Carlo, but I had a lot of fun learning from her as well.
And it was engaging, right? It wasn't just that one way street. And that was kind of one of the things that, as I was reading through this, it was really about kind of the sustainability of these relationships. I don't get me wrong, there are people that will find balance in distributing more than receiving, but it can't all just be one way or the other. And what that does is it creates that sustainability within balance.
Right.
And that's why setting the stage is so important. It's like, well, what are you expecting from balance? I think the more that you're out of balance, the thing that I think it generates into is burnout on one way or the other. I don't like this relationship because I'm not getting what I need out of it. Whether we talked about it or not, it's just not working.
Right. And I think that when you have that imbalance, not only, I just don't think it provides the mentee, or even if the mentee thinks they're getting everything that they quote unquote want, the goal is to create some sort of independence. And not so the relationship really should evolve over time as well, where I'm showing you how to do this, we're doing it together, and then you're off doing it on your own, and whatever it is, managing a diabetic or it doesn't, that it sounds like I'm talking solely about surgery, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. The goal is to, like I said, gain independence and then find the next thing. And if that means moving on to a new mentor, then that's what it is.
Yeah, for sure. And that's kind of the other thing is you're looking to kind of just broaden your understanding of a skill set for the most part. One of the things that we talk a lot about on here and things that I've identified just from an outsider's perspective is one of the biggest gaps, and I think probably one of the biggest things to learn in practice is communication, because there's so much focus on didactic and then the tangible skills. Don't get me wrong, like there is a huge portion of a mentorship, especially straight out of vet school, that's like, I got to learn how to do surgery because I've only been able to do so much. It doesn't really matter where you go at this point, or clinical experience, that sort of stuff. You got to have somebody that's, willing to kind of push you to the next level. But the thing that I've noticed is because of the emphasis on those two sides, there's this gap between most of your newly practicing vets and the caregivers. It's like we got to speak the same language, and there's some learning to be done there, because it's really hard to focus on that, I think, during those 4 years of vet school, because there's so much of the didactic stuff you have to stuff in there.
And I think there's a certain amount of the communication side of it with in mentorship that can happen. Like with us, I think a big part of the mentorship at PAW from a communication standpoint is understanding informed consent. But you still have to find your own voice. Like I don't go into a room and use the exact same words Carlo would use. The talk path, everything that is communicated is the same, but if I don't use Katie's voice, I'm actually not going to achieve my goal. If I try to say things the way Carlo would say it, I'm not going to hit all the points I need to say. So providing some of that structure, I think, helps to facilitate gaining those communication skills. But certainly there's so much of it that you just have to practice over and over again and figure out, okay, this worked, this didn't.
And that actually kind of brings me to the next thing that caught my eye in here was, as a mentee, you will be encouraged to think and manage, and I would add communicate independently, right? So your mentor likely and shouldn't say that they do have all the answers. If you have somebody that says like, I'm going to take you from point A to point B and you're not going to miss a step along the way, well, that's a lie. I think the intention of our mentorship program is not about not realizing success, or I guess minimizing its failure. It's just like having failure safely, like being able to walk into a room and have a structure of things to talk about within the informed consent process and saying, go, and you're going to fumble. It's no different from teaching people to work up front. It's like the next 10 phone calls. The first 10, they're just going to be awful.
Right.
Just tell the person right away that you've never done this before and this is the first time. And if you really need somebody to step in, that's why we have trainers, that sort of stuff. But there's only so much that you can learn before you actually do it. But the more that you can create a relationship that encourages that independence, focused a little bit more on just setting the pillars they have to stand on, but then they build up from there, I think is the best way to do it. And then everybody just kind of does that in their own way. How do you set the pillars is really the question of the mentorship relationship. I know you didn't have a ton of mentee experience, like you didn't have like a super like defined mentorship experience outside of school, but do you have anything that really kind of set those pillars for you?
Well, and so I was thinking, so if we talk, right, so in undergrad, I had great mentors, which I think is why when I went to vet school and kind of struggled to really find an informal mentor, and then formally got matched with my mentor, and certainly he, and I talked about him in my podcast, but I mean, it was really nice to have someone that had, been in practice and then was in a non-traditional role and kind of allowed me to see all of that and talk to him about all of that. But it wasn't like we didn't have a formal agreement like this. At that point in time, this hadn't been published. And I actually don't think I read this until probably 2012, maybe. I didn't read this right away. Maybe even later, to be perfectly honest.
Nothing wrong with that.
So, but then, right, going into first year, second year in the actual profession, no, other veterinarians I did not see as mentors. Probably from a true mentor relationship, and now she remains one of my good friends, and she works for one of the corporate practices, as a trainer, and she's a supervisor now. And so now it's interesting that now I own a practice and she's a supervisor, and so we can we actually kind of continue that informal relationship where we can talk about work and say, oh yeah, I'm having these communicate, and most of the time it's about communication, right? This this person's underperforming because this communication issue happened. But initially, when we met, we were both working at the same practice and had moved from more rural practices and just getting used to practicing kind of small animal exclusive and not that Wausau's a big city, but different than certainly a very rural practice setting. Yeah,
and that actually, so that type of a relationship, I think, is one that is a good example, because you didn't walk into that relationship expecting a mentor-mentee type thing, right? And I think that's that highlights a neat function of these types of relationships. It is not necessarily about just the distribution of information or wisdom. It is creating an effective feedback loop between each other, because you're both going to build each other up.
Well, and I do want to interrupt because I failed to mention. So she is a licensed technician. She is not a veterinarian. So I encourage young veterinarians, if they can find a technician with a lot of experience, like, you can learn a lot from them. Because I sure did.
Yeah, and that was one of the things. A little bit of an aside, but I scroll Instagram and on the PAW page, I follow absolutely everything that I can, because like you said, I'm an outsider, so I got to get my feel for what's happening out in the world. But one of the things that came up was it was satire, and it was something about there's nothing worse than a grumpy old vet tech, the senior vet tech or something like that. It's probably the meanest person you're ever going to meet. And I'm like, well, that's not effective at all. How about we walk into this potential relationship and try and learn something, rather than just assuming that just because they've been doing this for 20 years, they're going to be crotchety and mean. because like Trevor, he's,
Right.
he's probably one of our best teachers. And for those that are coming into our organization on that level or outside, for the new docs too, like they all say like he's super great to work with because he doesn't just spoon feed everything.
Right.
And he's really supportive, but also like he'll challenge him when he has to. It's one of those things that he's accidentally learned. He's probably never taken a specific action to get great at what he does. But over time,
I think it comes back. Sorry, it comes back to serving the patient, right?
Yeah. Yep.
He does his job. He does his job well. He knows when he needs to advocate for the patient.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things that kind of showed stood out, was there's a section under mentee roles and responsibilities. Again, this is probably going to be a little bit more of the focus of the conversation because
absolutely.
The mentor side is, I think, a little bit more self-explanatory. But the second point in there is takes responsibility to own the relationship, discusses and priorities professional needs and goals. The reason that this one stood out is they put own in highlight or in quotation marks because we talk about that every day, up, down, left, and right, as a fundamental piece of our creating accountability process. And that just takes one small chunk of it. And it basically says you as a mentee have the power to create a relationship that you need, as long as you're willing to say what it is and go out into the world and find it. It's not going to be brought to you, or I shouldn't say it's very low likelihood. I just believe that there are some education systems that are doing like mentor pairing and that sort of stuff,
so,
which is, you might get lucky, but
and again, that's the one mentor I had in vet school. That was one of those match programs.
Yep.
And the good thing is he was a volunteer to that program, so it was something he was interested in doing, was willing to invest the time, which is fantastic. And I can see though on the flip side where if it's like, okay, we're matched now, and then you meet and you chat, and if you don't take the opportunity at that first meeting to kind of define, hey, how often are we going to meet? Mm-hmm. Are we just going to, and again, my vet school experience was like before text messaging and social media and all of those things. So it was phone calls and emails.
Yep. Had to be a little more deliberate about it.
And so if you actually read the article as well, it talks about phone calls and emails and even like, oh gosh, I think like hand letters and things like that aren't necessarily as, I don't want to say necessary, but certainly I wouldn't expect like a mailed in letter, hey, I'm looking for a mentor. I think email is certainly professional enough for this type of thing.
And I would say that's kind of the big thing is like the world pre-COVID had gotten significantly smaller, and now post-COVID, it's like since everyone's so used to digital interaction, at this point, there's the excuse of the barrier of distance doesn't really exist. It used to substantially more, but at this point, not really something that you can kind of fall on. So what does that do? It just opens the door to more opportunity. But if let's say you're, third, fourth year, whatever, and you're really just trying to get your feet in to have a clinical experience somewhere where it's like, hey, I like the way that this person thinks. And you do that outreach process and they say yes, and then you show up there and they say, what are you looking to get out of this? And you just have no answer. That's where, you as a mentee own this process, because a really good mentor will first start with, what are your expectations? What are you trying? What are you seeking out of a relationship with me? And then what am I seeking out of you? Because I wouldn't have as a mentor said yes if I wasn't interested in engaging in helping you improve your career. I think that part's the given, and that's why we kind of not necessarily avoid it. We just don't have to talk about it. But as a mentee, how do you want to advance your career?
Right.
What are you looking for within this 3-week period? Or, if I decide to hire you within the allotted amount of time for us, that 3-month time that you really need to focus on so that you can hit the ground running once I'm not standing right here. And that element of self-awareness, I think, is probably the most important thing that they can have.
Well, and that is exactly what I was just thinking, is that if you can, do that going into, each of your elective externships, we're going to be primarily emergency. Okay, what do I need to work on in emergency? If I have the opportunity,
Yep.
What are the things I know I need to do? And practicing so that, okay, now I'm going to an elective GP practice. Okay, what are my weaknesses in wellness and preventive care that I need to work on? That kind of critique carries a negative connotation, but it is being able to self-evaluate yourself and say, yep, this is what I need to work on, and help me. How can you help me do it? And then, I really liked the part, and it was where, what does the mentor provides resources and solutions, not necessarily, like you said, all the answers. Okay. Yep. We talked about this, and this is how I would approach this case. This is how I would approach this surgery. These are the tools that I've used. This textbook, this article, this whatever. I really recommend reading it.
Yeah, because that's where you built your base of knowledge off of. That's why I think, when we do these, and like, I have a hard time not trying to talk about the books that I've read. It's a similar thing. Like, yeah, you can get it from me, but I'm not the guy that originated this thought or whatever that is. And that actually brings me to kind of an interesting thing, and kind of looking at the stuff that you're going to be talking about a little bit later today, is when you made the transition from mixed animal to small animal, like, there was a lot of extra outside of work time invested in setting the knowledge base necessary to succeed at least a base level in that general practice setting. I guess, as somebody who is fortunate enough to be in a position to mentor other students, what is a reasonable expectation in your mind of, like, what a person should be doing outside of school or a work setting in terms of gathering knowledge? And
this is, I wanted to circle back to advanced insights, and this is a good circle, right? One, I think it would be beneficial, like, if you are going into a mentor-mentee relationship, that if you have that information in front of you and you can share it with one another, so you at least get an idea of the type of personalities that you're dealing with. And for me, for a lot of people, or for a lot of our employees, like, yeah, I like the DISC part of it. Okay. What's the personality? The motivators. I come back to, like, my main motivators, theoretical. And so I just told one of the students, like, I like to learn just for the sake of learning because I'm nerdy like that. And so for me, even at home, and I'm on social media, I'm hopping on Clinician's Brief and reading, like, vet articles because it's interesting.
Yeah, and
that isn't relaxing or enjoyable to everyone, right? I gain a certain amount of enjoyment from doing that. That isn't work to me. So for me to say, you should be spending this much time out of work, or, putting this much extra time, I'm not sure is a fair statement, but you aren't going to learn everything you need to learn in the first, within the confines of a 40-hour work week. It just isn't going to happen. And some of that is when you start a new job, learning the computer system. learning, whether you get direct information like you would from Advanced Insights, or just having to learn people's personalities by interacting with them, and kind of figuring out, okay, how do I communicate best with these people? Like I said, the computer system, how you're going to write your notes, all the talking to the caregivers that have been with the practice for 25 years, and you're the new person that they have to learn to trust. So, that takes time too. Those are skills that need to be developed in addition to, again, it's not that you will never stop learning, but it certainly is very heavy, I would say, first 2 to 3 years out of in practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of the purpose, though, of the relationship, right? It's to kind of accelerate that time frame. And I think you hit on something that's really important in one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with, they don't know that they do, and I'm trying to figure out the right way to put it, is like, for us, the whole team has a shared purpose, right? The whole team is to serve the patient, and there's nobody here that kind of lacks that understanding. But when you take that step further and you say, okay, well, then kind of the why of the why is, like, for me, I'm the economic and political and theoretical as well, but we all have these different values that are kind of intrinsic a little bit more to our upbringing, and you hit on something that's really important within self-awareness is not necessarily that there is a right or a wrong expectation of learning outside of work or outside of that mentor-mentee relationship. It's more about knowing or setting that in all likelihood, the most successful mentor and mentee relationships share at least a few values. Right. Because for you to mentee someone that's a low theoretical, that is a utility learner, would probably be more difficult than someone that's just super receptive to knowledge. And also, typically, if you have somebody that's high theoretical, not only will they be receptive, they will seek to distribute as much as they can as well, because that's what they value. Well, I'm going to bring value to somebody else. So being able to have kind of that more core of like why it is that we do what we do is a really important thing. So the more that you can understand what those 7 motivators are, and if you go back to team crafting, which I believe is somewhere between 16 and 19, I do detail out all of those. So definitely go and check that out. But yeah, I think that's kind of an important process of evaluating that relationship.
Yeah.
And
well, and that he talks about mentor roles and responsibilities is to ensure that the mentee understands and commits to the practice mission, vision, and values.
Yep.
And so and this is more specific, I guess, for a new graduate getting hired to their first practice, wanting a mentor. Before you sign up, if they say, I'm going to provide mentorship, okay, what is the practice's vision? What is the mission? And if your mentor doesn't know that, you guys aren't going to have shared purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, I think that would be number one, red flag. And the other thing this was a new thought for me as we were kind of talking about sitting down to do this. So many times people are like, well, here's my contract and these are my benefits and and I've been promised mentorship. Mm-hmm. And, the article talks about having a written agreement. And I mean, it's really, if a big part of your job fulfillment is going to be, and not that, money matters. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to make a living. Mm-hmm. But realistically, if your success in that practice is going to hinge on the mentorship that you are being provided, why aren't you get that in writing?
Yeah.
What is your expectation of me? Because this is what I am expecting. And again, it's that kind of shared, okay, now we both come into it. with, the similar expectations. And that way, when you aren't getting the mentorship that you guys had mutually agreed upon, 3 months down the line, you can say, hey, this was my expectation. We agreed to this. Is there a way we can steer back down this path?
It actually goes to the next thing about kind of that maintenance. That
Right.
was the next thing that really that stood out to me was what is the expectation of evaluating this along the way? Because no different from any relationship, there are points that you're going to kind of, I call them grow up moments, because that's what I've done with all of my friends. But basically, are we going to go further? Are we going to go beyond this point? Or, are we just going to say, now we're friends, but we're not best friends or whatever?
Right.
And that's having a scheduled period of time to do that is really important. And that's for us, that's where the 90-day mark kind of came around. It's not that that's the only point of consideration on
Right.
how things are going, but it's scheduled, it's deliberate, and then it's every 6 months, if not more often thereafter.
Right.
But it allows it's just a designed opportunity for both sides to basically say whatever it is that they have to say. There's not a right or wrong within that. And the more that you can lay that out at the onset of that relationship, the more likely it is to succeed over time, because what does that do? It allows you to actually have tenets of accountability. Hey man, we agreed to this, and
Yes.
you're not holding up your end of the bargain. And the looser that you are at the onset, you're either going to just flounder for a while. Sometimes you'll get lucky and it'll work. That happens all the time. But if you're in this midst of a lack of clarity of what the expectations are, at some point it's
I think you can have, certainly we've dealt with situations where it's here's this loose definition, let's just get our feet wet and see what happens.
absolutely.
And you can still, if there's vulnerability and trust and all of those things come together, you can still be successful and lay kind of groundwork later. However, it becomes much more emotional. It just does. And I think if you can't, and when emotions get involved, it does make it harder to come over the other side. So if you can, again, like you said, lay the groundwork, and then we kind of don't run in, and it's not that we can eliminate emotions out of it completely. I mean, that's just not the way veterinary medicine works, period. But the more clarity you can have at the beginning, I do think sets you up for success long term.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things too with that kind of, and it's not specifically specifically within one individual section, but I think one of the things that they really that colors this whole article is there's definite value in having goals, right? And being able to set what are my expectations, what are my measurables. I believe they talk about SMART goals in here.
Very, very briefly, yeah. And that's, something I feel gets talked about at many points in careers, I feel over and over again.
I used to be a big I used to try to think that way because I used to think I was a goal motivated person, but I think there's an interesting dichotomy there between you gotta know where it is that you're headed at least a little bit, but also you have to be more willing to buy into the process and not be super concerned about taking the most direct path towards the goal, because sometimes you're going to wander off to the left because there's something over there that you have to know, and you're going to detour back, and you're not going to lose your heading, but it's not that super direct path. And even with a great mentor-mentee relationship, it's essentially an impossibility for that person to just lay the yellow brick road and say, this is how you get to Oz. They're not going to have every answer. And if you walk into that relationship,
and if you think they do, you're going to pull the curtain back and find out that they don't.
I'm so glad that metaphor works because it just came out of nowhere. But yeah, like valuing that learning process, I think it is really operative. The other thing too, in thinking about some of the other like potential red flags, is setting your own individual necessity for like what is success in like defining it. So one of the things that within the advanced insights that I really like to hit on, especially for people that have never been exposed to it, is what's called role awareness. So it's a 0 to 10 scale, and the higher the number, the more detail that person generally desires in like set, like what is my path to success? The higher the number, the deeper the job description, basically.
Glad, see, this is the one I struggle with the most is the end of this, and I'm glad you're talking about this specifically right now.
Yeah, that's so that one is interesting because it sets the standard for kind of how to train the person, but also the positive or plus equals and minus indicators tells me a little bit about their headspace and how satisfied and fulfilled they are in life. Most of the time it's professional, sometimes it's personal, like if they have like some people have such a phenomenal personal relationship with their partner or whatever, like it can overcolor, like I don't really like my job, but I don't care. Or they can have such a shitty marriage that it's like, I love my job, but I hate everything else. But generally speaking, it's a professional station in life. But really hitting on, that level of definition is if I'm in the position of I'm seeking a mentor, the first thing I'm going to do is write out their job description, because I have the utmost opportunity to lay out as much detail for them as I need. And that, because if I'm okay working in that loose environment, they now know that, because I just walked into the room and said, I don't need a ton, but I need you to really hit these big things and like just be willing to hear me out. Or if I'm somebody that really needs to have the 4 deep process, the more that person knows it at the onset, they'll just be able to be honest with you, because some people can't handle that. I know, like you and I, we have a hard time in really laying out, unless it's out of absolute necessity, the super deep, to the T process, versus some other people really value that, and that's the only way that they can think. So the more that you can set the standard of basically, how deep does this description have to go? The easier it's really just about that, right? It's ease of setting the relationship right from the get-go. Yep. Some other stuff that's in there is also going to be self-direction. I think that the really within that variable, the important part is just assume, even if you don't know, that a mentee is minned out on self-direction. They don't know where they're headed. Right. Now, some people will have a pretty good idea, but a mentor, I would say that a mentor's part in that relationship is just being a resource to help that person figure it out. And not necessarily saying, here, kid, I'm going to point you this way, run, just trust the fog. It's like, no, like they're going to take a step and they're going to look back and they're going to ask you a question, right?
Well, and I think this goes back into I hate to call it old school, but the way the profession was set up, these small practices where the older vet hired the younger vet, and you're going to buy my practice in this many years, like I'm going to sell it to you. So like, let's do this. You come work for me, and then I'll sell you my practice, and then you're going to do that. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to work for 20 years, and then you're going to hire someone, and you're going to sell this practice to them. So to me, like, that's the vision I get. Like, all right, come on, I'll be your mentor. Because I have a more self-serving purpose in mind. And you can't do that going into that relationship.
No, unless for some reason you both know that that's exactly where you're headed. But again, like there's
sometimes even then, and I'm not saying that's a bad situation. Like if you want to own a practice, and there is someone that owns a practice, and they are looking to sell, in the next however many years, and that is your goal, and you guys talk, and that's a mutually agreed upon goal, that is great. Yeah. Right? And you work towards that. If that's the case, however, then that mentor at some point also needs to include you in the business side of things, because again, just kind of the stories you hear, I got hired, I've spent 5 years working here, now they want to sell to me. But I have no idea about what's going on with the actual business of this practice. That was never a mentor-mentee relationship for purchasing and being business partners or being a business mentor. That was, again, so defining, yes, this is our ultimate goal, and how are we going to get there? Yeah, that's what I was going to kind of circle back to, right? Is like, if you have basically non-associate level interests. Right. So for us, we talk about there's the shelter medicine interest and ER and administrative are the three that, and wellness I think is our fourth defined one. But that's why we put that in there right away. Is like, okay, let's just acknowledge the very potential reality that you're not going to be an associate veterinarian or CVT for the full duration of your career. At some point, you're probably going to get somewhere outside of that, which is either going to be like management, ownership, something, right, education. I'm not really sure what interests you, and the more that can kind of, again, color the initial portion of that relationship, the better, because you avoid that roadblock later down the road. Yep. Yeah. One more thing, because we got to wrap up here in just a little bit. Let me see if I can find it here. This was the other thing, is understanding our audience of primarily veterinary school students seeking a DVM title. Sorry, I don't know the exact word there, but accreditation. There it is, if that's the right word. It feels right. Both mentee and mentor can broaden the other's understanding of complex issues. And another great benefit is that with the rapid advance of veterinary knowledge, mentors will be able to learn the most up-to-date medicine from their recently trained colleague. That's something that I think could potentially get taken for granted pretty immediately. And one thing that Caroline had talked about in the last podcast that we did was when she graduated vet school, there were people in the setting that were saying, this is the smartest you'll ever be, which triggered the hell out of me. But I get it in principle, right? Because what does that mean? You have a very wide knowledge base. You're being just hammered with so much stuff, right? And then over time it tapers down, like you find where your niche is somewhere along the way, and your knowledge base gets deeper. It's not necessarily that you get it dumber. You just you go from wide and shallow to narrow and deep. And walking into any mentee mentor relationship, I think that's a pretty important understanding, because like my understanding of urinalysis results might be different because what I've been exposed to is different. And then what does that do? It creates an opportunity for a productive exchange, not just for one person to say that they're right and the other person to just have to go with it. When you were working with the new docs, did you experience that at all with them, where there was kind of that interchange on anything medically, I guess? Anything that stands out? Can't well, when you're talking about that, the thing I guess that that struck me was the perfect example, right? Is so Carlo and I have been out of vet school for almost 15 years now. And that knowledge base for me is, has funneled very differently than him.
Yeah.
Can we do, is there a ton of overlap? Absolutely. But are there things that I'm going to call him and be like, hey, I need you to walk me through this real quick? And and there are certainly times when I get a phone call at like midnight. Okay, I've got this. What do you think? Mm-hmm. So, the skill sets, there's value to all of the different skill sets. Mm-hmm. Is I guess what I was trying to say.
Yeah, and that was so when we had the gentleman here from the sheriff's office. Oh. Mm-hmm. And I was trying to explain that it's like, in the event of a significant trauma or something like that, it's like, no, Katie knows how to stabilize, right? Like that's really, you focus on the internal medicine side or something like that. And then Carlo, a little bit more of the artist in the surgical sense. It's like, in that and trying to explain that relationship to somebody that doesn't know like the full depth of how intense veterinary medicine is, that can be easily misunderstood as because one thing solves the problem,
right?
That can be overvalued. Whereas I think what you're kind of say is like, it doesn't really matter where you're putting your value. The whole point of each piece is to serve the patient. So if you're really good at the beginning, it doesn't mean that it's less valuable to the whole picture, even though it doesn't put the period at the end of the sentence.
Right. Yep.
So really I think that's a good way to kind of wrap up is, with a mentor and a mentee, the mentee is going to have that wider range, right? And be able to ask some leading questions kind of throughout that whole process, because the information that they have is again wider, but more shallow. And it allows them to kind of accidentally, or I guess naturally, accidental is not the right word, but naturally funnel in a way that is really interesting to them. And then that's reinforced through what they're learning outside of work and that sort of stuff.
Well, and there are certainly, to get back to with the new graduates, I would probably say so they would ask a question, well, why do you do that? It's like, I'm pretty sure I learned why at some point.
Yeah.
And now I just do it.
Yeah.
But then going back to find that resource, or there's questions that they ask and I'm just like, I don't know. It's like, but we could probably find it out if we look here or here or here. So let's go do that together.
Yep. Do you ever find that really weird that like you become just like your own library and you forget where sources come from, but it's like, I know this is right and I can't tell you why. That's because I've read so many things that are within the same ballpark of like communication and kind of leadership stuff. It's like, that's in a book. Which one? I forgot which one at this point. But yeah, I mean, really wanted to, again, just touch a little bit on some of the stuff that's within this article here. And again, with, we're almost, it's February, but that means we're almost to May, right? Mm-hmm. Those that are going to be listening to this are probably going to be setting these, their first career mentor out of school here relatively shortly, if they haven't already done that. So what would you kind of, if you had to get in the ear of a vet school student today that's walking into a relationship, kind of what would you be your best advice to them?
Like I said, I will go back to, if one of the things that was a linchpin to you accepting your job, because most people have already accepted if you are a fourth year student, you have probably already accepted a job offer, or are considering job offers. If one of those things is mentorship in the practice, make them define it before you sign on the dotted line. One, it shows, it just demonstrates how important it actually is to you. And then two, it lays the groundwork for success. Mm-hmm. The more clear you can be, the better kind of definition you can have of your expectations from the beginning. At least, like I said, it may not end up being successful, but you've at least set yourself up to be successful.
Yeah, and that was kind of where I was going to lead into, is like, once you have that, then be ready to walk in, ready to be enthusiastic and as receptive as possible.
Right.
Because the more that you can engage the process, at the very least, the faster you will know how effective that relationship will be. Because the more you stand off, the slower it develops, and it's going to develop into a good thing or a not good thing. So the more that you push that process, the faster you'll have that definition, and the sooner that you can get into a relationship that is ideal for the way in which you want to learn and kind of what you want to do with your career.
Yep.
That is. We're pretty much right on time there. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Thank you, Katie. I really appreciate the time, and we'll see you guys next time.